Today's topic is going to be talking about, I'm going to be talking today about brain dysregulation and excitotoxicity, which is a topic that I haven't really seen addressed at all in the psychiatric survival community, probably because this is one of the first times I've seen it mentioned. I just happened to stumble upon this potential mechanism related to the damage that a lot of us experience when doing a little bit of research a few weeks ago. I haven't really posted too many videos lately for some personal reasons. This endeavor is not easy to do, to post videos like this. I feel compelled to do it, but we have to be careful about the things we say and the people that we let in on what we're doing when we make videos like this. So I've taken a little time off, but now I have returned because in the end I just cannot. My life's been so severely affected by these drugs that I just can't not make these videos. And I feel like I'm, maybe helping somebody kind of understand what's going on when I make these videos. All right, so let's get into the details here. Let me just move my microphone over a little bit. So, what are we going to be talking about today? Well, a lot of this, what I'm going to be talking about today came to be because I saw this post from this Patients Like Me profile called Autostrada, which she writes. Now, this Autostrada was a lady who went to see a number of psychiatrists in the San Francisco area, something like 50 of them, and she finally found one doctor who worked with her and allowed her to basically understand what was going on with her body. So that's what qualifies her. I suspect that from all these doctor visits and based on her own educational background, she was able to determine some of the potential mechanisms that are related to her, her current situation. This is what she wrote, and I think it's a really interesting statement, and that's why I'm going to read it to you. So she wrote, "Antidepressant withdrawal symptom has nothing to do with the mythical imbalance of serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine that antidepressants are supposed to treat. It is not relapse or emergence of a psychiatric condition. It is autonomic damage." Now, these are the two important points. These are the mechanistic changes that occur. Disinhibition of the locus coeruleus and the subsequent glutamatergic hyperactivity, which develops in the presence of serotonin receptor downregulation, a recognized consequence of antidepressant use. And she continues, "The initial issue with antidepressant withdrawal symptom is rebound of other symptoms. While the serotonin system is still downregulated and cannot contribute to regulation. For some people, it takes a long time for the serotonin receptors to correct. In the meantime, other symptoms take over and establish a dysfunctional homeostasis without adequate serotonergic participation." So what does that mean? Well, I'm going to break down these two mechanisms that she described that contribute to antidepressant quote-unquote withdrawal symptom. And as I've mentioned in my previous videos, I don't really think this is withdrawal. It's something more complicated than just a classic drug withdrawal. So let's look at the locus coeruleus. I'm sorry for all the text, just bear with me a little bit here. So the locus coeruleus is a nucleus in the pons, which basically means that it's the beginning of neuronal projections neurons that project throughout the entire brain. And it's basically involved with the fight and flight response. It's the principal site for synthesis of norepinephrine. Now, norepinephrine is a very important neurotransmitter, and as I've talked about in my previous videos, antidepressants do directly affect norepinephrine as well as dopamine. They affect acetylcholine. They affect a number of hormones as well. But norepinephrine is a really important one because it's the neurotransmitter responsible for basically all cellular signaling in response to activation or in the fight and flight response. And it also is critically important just to maintain homeostasis within the brain. Now, so it connects to virtually all areas of the brain, in particular the brainstem, which controls heartbeat and it controls breathing and basically your vital functions. The spinal cord, cerebellum, hypothalamus, and the thalamic nuclei, the amygdala, the telencephalon, and the cortex. So most parts of your brain that are responsible for maintaining, the basic functions that you understand as life and consciousness are affected by norepinephrine. Its functions include arousal, attention, memory, the sleep-wake cycle, which is a problem for people that take antidepressants and try to get off of them. Behavioral flexibility, inhibition, which is critical. Inhibition is very important because if you start to affect inhibition, you're going to have behavioral changes that may be seen as erratic in society. Stress, cognitive control, so control over your cognitive functions, emotions, neuroplasticity, posture, and balance. So the locus coeruleus, if there's any changes to this, may be problematic, as you can imagine. So let's take a look at some of the projections from the locus coeruleus, and if you look on this graph, you'll see those arrows. Those are actual neurons that begin at the locus coeruleus and then literally extend throughout the entire brain, and all the projections into the various regions, which then obviously connect onto other neurons, which, when working as a whole, contribute to consciousness as you understand it. And so when you stop taking antidepressants, your norepinephrine system goes into hyperdrive or overdrive, which causes massive overstimulation, not only to the brain, but not only overstimulation, but also excitability. Your threshold for panic and for overstimulation is dropped. So now things that used to not bother you so much all of a sudden can trigger panic attacks. They can have intense symptoms from stimulation that used to not cause any symptoms at all. So it can obviously be a problem. If you look at the sympathetic system here, you'll see that it controls basically not only your brain, but also your peripheral nervous system and all the organs throughout your entire body. So if there is a problem with your norepinephrine system, you're going to have some major problems in all the organ systems throughout your entire body, including your genitals, your liver, your stomach, your lungs and your heart, your eyes, salivation, pretty much everything is affected if this hypothesis is correct. And I don't see any reason why not. I mean, a lot of people that go through antidepressant withdrawal experience a lot of these symptoms associated with these various organ beds. So that's glutaminergic. I'm not glutaminergic. That's locus coeruleus hyperactivity or overstimulation of the fight and flight response. And here's Autostrada's statement, which continues from where I left off. Reacting with fight or flight to the least stimulation, the dysregulated alerting system causes inappropriate production of the fight or flight hormones, norepinephrine, noradrenaline, and cortisol. Now, I've talked about in my previous video that cortisol is one of the powerhouse hormones in the body. It basically controls every single part of your entire body. Same thing with norepinephrine. And so when you have an inappropriate production of these hormones and neurotransmitters, you might have some fairly serious problems. She continues, spurts of elevated cortisol cause many symptoms, from muscle stiffness to pain to waves of anxiety, panic, and despair. Central nervous system instability causes symptoms my doctors call autonomic dumping. Excessive glutaminergic activity and appropriately raised cortisol at night cause the awful withdrawal insomnia. Insomnia is a very serious condition. I personally experienced it for many months and still have very difficult time sleeping. She continues, sleep disorders are very, very common in withdrawal symptom for the above mentioned reasons. So that is the mechanistic underpinning related to some of these overexcitatory symptoms that people experience, including sleep disorders. What I thought was actually the most interesting part of Autostrada's statement was not necessarily the norepinephrine and the locus coeruleus disinhibition, but I thought the glutaminergic consequences were particularly interesting because if you do a little research into glutamate, you realize that they control the excitability of virtually all neurons in the entire body. Like virtually every neuron, from your genitals to your toes to basically all regions of your brain, are controlled by this one neurotransmitter, glutamate. And when glutamate is activated, it allows for cell signaling using calcium, the calcium ion as a mode for transmitting signals. Glutamate in the brain controls a number of pathways, sort of like norepinephrine did. This is another one of those graphs. It's just flipped to to the opposite direction as the previous one. So this is looking at it from a different view, but it's the same brain. As you can see, the projections begin down in the pons and the brainstem here, and project up into the cortex and throughout the thalamus, nucleus accumbens, the striatum. Basically, all of these regions are principally affected by glutamate, but the whole rest of the brain, in one way or another, is affected by glutamate, just in the fact that it's the necessary neurotransmitter for cellular excitation, and the relaxation neurotransmitter is GABA, the one that's GABA is basically the neurotransmitter that benzodiazepines act upon, and when you have that's a different talk, but basically when you take benzodiazepines, you downregulate the GABA receptors, which causes when you stop taking them, all of a sudden your brain can't put the brake on the excitability. You have these same sorts of symptoms, this overexcitability. So there is some overlap between the drugs, between the various psychiatric drugs. Antidepressants can potentially cause overexcitability because of glutaminergic hyperactivity. So what that means basically is that when serotonin receptors are downregulated as a consequence of taking antidepressants, which I've documented in my previous videos, when those serotonin receptors are downregulated, when you're taking the antidepressant, you shouldn't have any major difficulties because homeostasis is established. When you downregulate those receptors, your body is doing that to establish homeostasis because of this toxin that's introduced into your system. When the toxin is introduced into your system, you have overstimulation of these serotonin receptors. Your body is in panic mode. It does whatever it can to knock down these neuronal transmissions, and what it does is it desynthesizes the serotonin receptors. As a consequence, however, when you stop taking these drugs, those serotonin receptors take a while to regenerate, and they can take some time indeed, from many months to a number of years. And in that time period, glutamate is allowed to ramp up because there's no break. Because it's not just GABA, but serotonin works in concert with all the other neurotransmitters to basically establish homeostasis. So I actually am not 100% sure as to the particular mechanism between serotonin receptor downregulation and glutamate hyperactivity. So I'm just going to go with what Altostrada said here. According to her, glutamate hyperactivity occurs because of reduced serotonin receptors. And I will do some more research into this, but for now, I'm not going to question that particular hypothesis. One consequence of having an overactive glutamate system in the brain and the peripheral nervous system is potentially alarming. It's called excitotoxicity. And according to Wikipedia, I'm going to read this to you. Excitotoxicity is the pathological process by which nerve cells are damaged or killed by excessive stimulation by neurotransmitters such as glutamate and similar substances. This occurs when receptors for the excitatory neurotransmitter glutamate are overactivated by a glutaminergic storm. Basically, excitotoxins, which bind to these receptors. So basically, when glutamate, for one reason or another, is allowed to become overproduced or over present in the synapses and allow these receptors to activate, what happens is that high levels of calcium are allowed to enter the cell. The calcium influx into the cells activates a number of enzymes, including phospholipases, endonucleases, and proteases such as calpain. These enzymes go on to damage cell structures such as components of the cytoskeleton, membrane, and DNA. So, in a baseline state, glutamate is extremely important for cell functioning. But when you have a little bit too much or a lot too much of glutamate, you can have severe consequences to the health of the cell. So as this flowchart shows, basically what you have is an increase in cytosolic calcium, leading to increase in free radicals, which itself causes potentially cell death. This also causes mitochondrial damage, and when the energy is not able to be produced in order to maintain the cellular structures, you also have cell death. And mitochondrial damage, and the whole thing feeds back on itself, and it's a vicious cycle. And the way to get rid of it is to decrease glutamate levels, and therefore decrease calcium ion concentrations in the cell. But if you have too much glutamate, you're going to have an imbalance, and the imbalance in this situation can be quite problematic. Usually, if you look into the literature for excitotoxicity, most of the cases involve traumatic brain injuries, stroke, multiple sclerosis, anterior lateral sclerosis, I think is the term. A number of these other conditions. These are all proposed mechanisms for that. And in the non-published literature, there's a hypothesis that MSG. Now, I don't know how much validity this has, but it seems interesting that MSG may be proposed to cause excitotoxicity in the cell because it overactivates glutamate. And as you know, MSG is found in a lot of foods throughout our society. From most of the fast foods, any real Chinese food, any of the fast food Chinese places. For whatever reason, MSG is a quote-unquote conspiracy kind of subject, so I tend not to, I didn't really push it here, but it is interesting to know that people are talking about excitotoxicity from something as simple as a food additive. So if that is true, something like an antidepressant or a psych med, that could very well indeed cause a form of excitotoxicity. And as you can see here on this graph here, this is a cell, the blue circle, or oval here, and all those green things are receptors, and those little black things on top would be the glutamate. And when those black things bind to the green things, it causes... I'm sorry, the black things are actually not glutamate. Glutamate would be something that's not on here at all. Those black things are actually extracellular calcium. Well, that extracellular calcium, when enough glutamate is present, flows into the cell unabated. Usually those green things prevent the calcium from flowing into the cell, because if it does, it can cause a lot of damage. But when enough glutamate is present, those green things open up and the calcium flows freely down its electrochemical gradient. When calcium enters the cell, it degrades cell membranes, degrades proteins, increases free radicals, which causes cell death. Obviously, none of this is good. There is an interesting correlation to another website that I found called Jim Stone. Now, this is kind of a conspiratorial website, and I don't like to delve too much into conspiracies when they're not backed by too much evidence. But the story behind this graph here is that GlaxoSmithKline's website was hacked into at one point, and it became clear that they had done plenty of research into this subject of antidepressants and overexcitation and ultimately damage that occurs to the brain and the peripheral nervous system. Do I believe that? Well, I'm not sure about the story personally, but I do believe that these drug companies are very well aware of the effects that these drugs have on people that take them. And basically, what this graph shows, and I think this is Jim Stone's creation here, is basically you have on the top, you have a normal neuronal impulse. You have one impulse, and the next one's not quite as large, and the next one's a little smaller and smaller and smaller, because neurons protect themselves from damage from repeated input by attenuating that input if it occurs more than once. This is accomplished via depletion of neurotransmitters and their reuptake, and this appears to be based in sound physiological. This is basically a very common theme in physiology. You don't want to overstimulate something, and there is naturally built-in functions that prevent various parts of your body from overstimulating themselves until they become damaged. However, when you take an SSRI or an antidepressant or any of these psych meds, the natural neuronal ability to dampen the effects are decreased. Another thing you need to understand about taking antidepressants is that unlike taking, let's say you take something like ecstasy one time and you go to a rave, when you do that, it's only a one-time acute response. When you take antidepressants, typically you take these drugs by mouth once daily, which means that the mechanisms behind ecstasy and antidepressants are alarmingly similar, and you can see that in one of my previous videos. They basically do the exact same thing. So when you take a drug like ecstasy, you might have a very large spike, but then the next day your body is allowed, the drug is out of your system and your body's allowed to compensate for the effects and regenerate over time. But when you take something like an antidepressant every single day, now these drugs affect all these neurotransmitters too. So not only are you having effects on glutamate, but you're also having effects on norepinephrine and serotonin and dopamine and everything. So you have a lot of overexcitation occurring in all the areas of brain responsible related to all these neurons, and that's why your body downregulates all these, causes all these dysfunctional homeostatic states in your body when you take these drugs. It's trying to protect itself from overstimulation. So anyway, the graph basically shows an increasing baseline level of stimulation until you get to the point where the neurons basically fry themselves out. And unfortunately, a lot of these neurons, the gray matter that the projections from the RAF-A nucleus project to, are the gray matter in the emotional areas of the brain. So if this is true, and I'm not saying this is obviously not backed up by any scientific evidence. There's no paper that shows this. It's possible that these drugs are causing some form of damage to the brain, both directly, as shown in this graph, and indirectly through excitotoxicity. Now, I don't know to what extent excitotoxicity plays into the whole withdrawal symptom and the long-term damage that a lot of people experience, but it's probably part of it, especially considering that if serotonin receptors are downregulated and glutamate activity increases, there's no reason that a lot of these symptoms wouldn't occur, and that excitotoxicity would not actually be part of the equation. So very scary stuff, but very interesting as well, because this is at least a potential mechanism talking about how the nerve damage that a lot of people experience following antidepressant use can develop. So that's the end of the video. Hope you folks found this at least interesting. This is a topic that I have not seen addressed anywhere at all in the psychiatric survivor community. And so I really thought that Altostrada's statement here is a very good one. I'm going to show you right now the website to go to. Altostrada, patients like me. You can read the whole thing here. Really good summary of antidepressant withdrawal and a lot of the controversies and facts associated with a lot of the people that are dealing with these side effects. I highly recommend going here to anybody that's interested in reading it. Do your own research. What I'm showing you today is just my opinion. This is not medical advice. I'm not saying what's going on here is fact in your particular case. I'm just pointing out some evidence that I haven't seen pointed out previously. So I hope you found this video interesting and informative, and let me know what you think in the comments section below, and I will hopefully talk to you all soon. All right, until next time, stay well. All right, bye-bye.